Hi there. I want to start with something I've noticed after many years of working with IELTS students. There's a type of vocabulary that most students know about and most students know that they should be using, but most students don't actually use it on the day of the exam. And that type of vocabulary is phrasal verbs. Now, a quick explanation. I think most of you probably know what a phrasal verb is, but if you don't, a phrasal verb is sort of two words, a verb and a preposition normally, that when you put them together, they have a sort of a special meaning. For example, if you take the verb look and the preposition up, each of those have their own meaning. To look and up. But when you put them together, for example, in the sentence, I looked up the word in the dictionary, the phrasal verb looked up has a special meaning. It means to search or to find. So there are many of these expressions in the English language and are very common and are used very commonly by native speakers. Now, students don't use them, especially in exams, because they think they are informal. They're not correct for an interview like the IELTS exam. Now, today I want to explain why that decision is a bad one. And I want to give you something practical you can do about that. Now, the IELTS speaking band descriptors say that high-scoring students use a wide range of vocabulary. Phrasal verbs are a central part of that range. When an examiner is listening to you, they are checking whether you use language the way that a natural, fluent speaker does. And fluent speakers use phrasal verbs constantly. They don't even think about it. Native speakers learn them first, often before the formal word that means the same. When you don't use phrasal verbs, you do not sound sort of safer. You sound like someone who is avoiding them. And IELTS examiners, who have listened to thousands of candidates, notice when that language is missing. Okay. Let's talk about the most common reasons students give for avoiding phrasal verbs. They say, they are too informal for an exam. This idea comes from advice that is partly true, but only partly. I want to explain why. It's true that some phrasal verbs are informal. Chuck it in the bin, sort yourself out. These are sort of casual expressions, and they would sound strange in an IELTS speaking exam. For example, if you're discussing global health problems or something like that. But most phrasal verbs are sort of completely neutral. They are not informal, they are not formal, they're simply normal English, the kind of language that educated speakers use every day. Look at these examples. I grew up in a small town in the north. It's something I've always looked forward to. The issue comes down to a lack of investment. I came across this idea recently in something I was reading. None of these are informal. All of them are natural. These are exactly the kinds of phrases a Band 7 or Band 8 candidate uses easily. Not because they studied them last week, but because they've been using this kind of language for a long time. The problem with informal phrasal verbs is real, but it applies to a very small number of them, not to the majority of them. Avoiding all phrasal verbs because some of them are informal means losing a lot of very, very useful language. A lot of IELTS preparation focuses on learning unusual or impressive vocabulary. In a previous video, I explained why this is not always a good idea. But examiners also respond strongly to collocation, which means using words together in the way a natural native speaker would. Phrasal verbs are a good example of this. You do not just increase a decision, you build up to a decision. You do not just think about something, you think it through. These combinations are what makes language sound natural. And sounding natural is exactly what Lexical Resource is measuring. Okay, let's now think about why learning sort of lists of phrasal verbs doesn't always work. I mean, if you search for phrasal verbs for IELTS right now, you will find lists, long ones, 50 phrasal verbs, 100 phrasal verbs. Sometimes they're organised by topic, and the message is always the same. Learn these and then use them in the exam. When you use a phrasal verb on its own, for example, you learn that the phrasal verb break down means to stop working. You learn the meaning, but you don't really learn how to use it properly. For example, we use break down more with mechanical things, such as cars or washing machines, rather than, for example, computers. You do not know what words come before it or after it, or the grammar of the expression. For example, you need to know that we use breakdown with the car or machine as the subject, such as the car broke down. But we don't use it to describe a person causing the problem, such as, my husband broke down the car, because it normally describes something breaking by itself. And so if you don't know this information about the phrasal verb, when you try to use it, it won't fit into the sentence naturally, and it will show you don't really have a good understanding of how these phrasal verbs actually work. Okay, what actually works is learning these phrasal verbs in context, inside the kind of language you will actually use in the exam, not a separate item on a list. Here is a practical example. In IELTS Speaking Part 2, when you speak for 2 minutes on your own, you often need to describe a person, a place, an experience, or a change. These phrasal verbs appear naturally in that kind of personal story. I grew up in. I look back on that time as. It turned out to be. I ended up. I was brought up to believe. These phrases sort of belong together. They sound like a fluent person telling a story about their life. If you practice telling stories about yourself using these phrases, not memorising them, but actually using them in practice, they start to come naturally. You can do this with AI, for example, by prompting it to ask you questions about your life. If you want to learn them as a group, you could call them storytelling phrases or something similar. But again, focus on learning them in context and understand the exact meaning and use. Okay, let's think about phrasal verbs in Part 3. Part 3 of the speaking exam is where phrasal verbs can make the biggest difference to your score. In Part 3, the examiner asks you some more complex questions about society, about sort of change, about problems and solutions. The language you need is sort of clear, analytical, and conversational. This is exactly where neutral phrasal verbs work very well. These are the kinds of phrases that come up naturally in good Part 3 responses. For example, this comes down to a question of priorities. I think this stems from the way young people are brought up. It's difficult to keep up with the pace of change. Governments need to take this into account when making policy. These are not unusual or difficult phrases. They are just accurate, natural English for discussing complex ideas. This is what band sort of 7 to 9 sounds like. There is another way that phrasal verbs are useful in Part 3 that many students do not think about. Some phrasal verbs are really helpful to help you organise and connect your ideas as you speak. They show the examiner that your answer has structure. For example, that leads on to another issue. To go back to what I was saying, that ties in with the broader point about. I would like to build on that idea by saying. When you use phrases like these, your answers sound sort of organised and confident. It sounds like someone who is thinking clearly in English, not someone who is trying to remember vocabulary. Okay, let's now think about sort of 3 practical steps you can follow. Here are 3 things you can do to start learning phrasal verbs, and none of them involve sort of memorization or looking at lists. First, look back at the part 2 and part 3 answers you have already prepared or thought about. Find the places where you used a single word to describe something. Ask yourself, is there a phrasal verb that would sound more natural here? For example, instead of consider in a personal story, you might say think about or reflect on. Instead of encounter, you might say come across. Instead of continue, you might say carry on. These are small changes, but they make your language sound more natural. Second, when you practice speaking, and you should try to practice every day, whether that's with AI or another person, pay attention to the phrasal verbs that you use without thinking, the ones that come to you automatically. These are the ones you can rely on in the exam. Start from these and slowly add more. Thirdly, listen to fluent English speakers talking about the kinds of topics that appear in part 3. Podcasts work well for this. When you hear a phrasal verb being used, write it down, not on its own, but in the full sentence. The sentence shows you the grammar, the collocation, and the register or style together. Just want to finish this section with something important. The goal is not to use as many phrasal verbs as possible. Using too many phrasal verbs is also a problem. It could sound unnatural, but in a slightly different way. The goal is to reach a point where the right phrasal verb comes to you naturally at the right moment, because you've been using this kind of language enough that it feels normal. This is what fluency means, but that only comes with a little practice. Okay, let me bring this back to where we started. Phrasal verbs are not a risk, right? They are a resource. The real risk is avoiding them. In going into your exam, having decided to remove a large part of natural English from your speaking because of advice that was only sort of partly correct. The students who score well on Lexical Resource are not the ones who know the most rare or unusual words. They are the ones whose language sounds natural, like someone who has spent real time using English, not just studying it. Phrasal verbs are an important part of that. If you have been avoiding phrasal verbs, start with one small area. The part 2 personal narrative is probably the best place to begin, because the language is personal and conversational. Choose 5 phrasal verbs that fit the stories you tell about your own life. Practice them until they feel automatic. That's the work you need to do. And it's less work than you might think. If this video was useful, please share it with someone who's preparing for IELTS. There is a link in the description to join the Honest IELTS WhatsApp and Facebook communities, where I share practice tasks and also answer any questions people might have about the exam or about preparing for it. There's no spam, no advertising, just exam preparation and useful tips and advice. Okay, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.